Hello, everyone. My name's Tom Spare. Welcome to Spare a Thought, the podcast that shines a light on people, organisations, issues, and ideas that are often go underreported or are misrepresented in the media. Today's episode is part one of a two-part conversation on the Welsh language, Cymraeg, with part two dropping next week. It's a big topic and we've had a lot to say, so I've split it across two episodes to make it more digestible for you. This was recorded live on Substack, so thanks to everyone who tuned in when it was live. With St. David's Day just behind us, I wanted to look past the celebrations and get into the real mechanics and politics of the language. My guest is Ben Kitchener, and in this first part we get into the million speakers goal, the usage gap, the gulf between having the ability to speak Welsh and actually choosing to use it, and the financial and political pressures that come with devolution. But to start with, provided a bit of background on ourselves and a Welsh language icebreaker. Cool. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this Substack Live of Spare a Thought. So today I'm joined by Ben Kitchener. Shwmae, Ben? Croeso?
Shwmae, diolch yn fawr iawn i chi. Thank you.
Very good. And sut oed ti?
Yeah, mae popeth yn iawn dy fi. Beth amdano ti?
Wonderful, yeah. Ben Diagegeg today.
Da iawn.
Yeah. So Ben and I just had a quick exchange there. His better than mine in Welsh. So the native language of the country we both live in. Wales, or as it's known in Welsh, Cymru. The Welsh language and the politics of it are at the centre of our discussion today. A couple of years ago, I went to see Professor Laura McAllister, who's probably going to get a mention a fair few times today, at the School of Journalism when I was doing my MA. Laura is the former Welsh women's football captain, professor at Cardiff's Wales Governance Centre, and a vice president of UEFA. The speech was entitled Reason Not Rancour, A Route to a Better Wales. Today I want to centre our discussion on a similar theme and explore how the Welsh language can help Wales, Cymru, grow more confident as a nation, as a country, and as a collective of people. In that speech, Laura quoted the historian John Davies, who said, "The nation in its fullness has yet to be." And a lot of Welsh history will often refer to the potential of what is to come, which is a theme of many countries, particularly with sort of identity and nationalism. And with Wales, it's quite an interesting story. So together, Ben and I are going to explore why this nation in its fullness is yet to be. So it's a bit about history, it's about language, it's culture, and yes, it's about politics. Although today we're going to steer clear of party politics of Wales for many reasons. Also, we don't want to get in trouble. But there's also plenty of places, you can go for politics, and plenty of excellent podcasts that are coming out now. Today we're talking about small p politics rather than the big P. So everyday political decisions that we all make. So today is as much about the present as the past. And I hope it will also very much be about the future too. Ben, do you want to sort of give a little introduction and say who you are and why you're here today?
I'm Ben. I did my master's in Welsh Government and Politics, and I picked that course specifically so I could write a dissertation about language policy, because in the UK in general, it is very hard to find courses that do linguistics. And I wasn't too keen on the idea of going and doing a master's abroad, although I did consider it. Before that, I had studied Spanish and Russian at Bristol. I did Catalan as part of that. Before that, I took a year out and lived in Barcelona, and that's when I first kind of really came into contact with Catalan. And it's kind of Catalan as a minoritized language that got me into minority language politics, language policy, but also language has also been absolutely fundamental to my life. And I think that's kind of where I come at this from. And I've always been very big, as you can kind of tell from the masters, in trying to combine the politics behind this with the actual language policy itself. Because you'll find often in the literature, there's quite a big gap in terms of language policy will focus on things like education. It won't necessarily go into the politics about why certain actors speak about, language choices or policy or what we're doing in certain ways, which I think is equally important when it comes to this. I think there's a lot that we miss from that disconnect.
Mm. Well, yeah, and I was thinking about this in terms of, and we can get into it in the wider discussion about education. So, children that are in Wales will learn Welsh throughout their schooling, but then after that, what happens then? And often there's a bit of a cliff edge, really, that kids will spend years learning Welsh and understanding Welsh culture and language, but then what do they do with the language, particularly if they will move elsewhere? But in everyday life, if you live in South Wales like we do, I hear Welsh a lot more, particularly train stations, in the shops and everything, and particularly when there's events on. But at the same time, that it's not as widely spoken in everyday life, and that, again, that's part of that whole holistic picture, isn't it? It's about how do you not just invest a lot in education, but how do you keep the candle burning, so to speak?
Yeah, exactly. I will probably mention this a lot. The gap between ability and use is particularly wide here in Wales.
Mm.
I'll mention the statistic now. So there are about 25% of the population, according to the census and other measures, although there's arguments as to which you should use, can speak Welsh and have the ability to do so. But all of the use surveys that have been done, the percentage of the population using their Welsh on a daily basis has never really gone above 10%. I think it may have edged towards 12 at one point.
Mm.
So that's a fairly big gap in terms of people who can actually speak Welsh themselves not using Welsh. And that's just in Wales. There are also, as you've kind of hinted at, many Welsh speakers who then move to across the border to England mainly, but to other places as well. And so that has a knock-on effect on use. And it's that, I think use is the most important metric, and it's interesting to see how different areas with minoritized languages and language policy trying to restore languages focus on, the number of speakers, or do they focus on use? And you'll find in places like Catalonia and Quebec, it's all centered around use. People just kind of assume that everyone has the ability, partly because of the similarity of some of those languages, but also the education system is much stronger in terms of guaranteeing that everyone comes out with the kind of ability. Whereas in places like Wales, in places like the Republic of Ireland, there's a huge emphasis on the number of speakers. And a really fun fact is the Republic of Ireland, I think on their surveys they do, have about 2 million speakers of Irish Gaelic, which always surprises everyone. But when you then look at how many of them say they speak it poorly, it's almost the majority. And so, there's a question, does the number matter? Yes, it's quite important that people can. But if they're not using it, or if they don't feel comfortable using it, then it won't really change the dynamics of the shift away from those languages that is happening.
Yeah. And the similarity, I suppose, is number of registered voters versus the number of people that actually vote. It's all well and good having a registration drive, because ultimately higher registration will hopefully equal higher turnout, but you won't know until polling day. So I suppose the first thing to go into is the elephant in the room. We both sound very English. So neither of us are native Welsh speakers, and yet here we are talking about the Welsh language. But I think it's also really important that non-speakers are talking, or people that won't naturally speak Welsh are doing that. So let's start with you. You've made a little bit of reference to it already. What made you, as someone who's born in England, is that right?
Yeah.
Decide to learn Welsh? And I guess the follow-up to that is, what has Wales given to you to make you care so much about the language?
I'm going to tackle this in two parts. I probably sound very aggressively English to many people, because of the kind of, I've come from Hertfordshire, so southern England. I came from a family that was entirely monolingual. I didn't realize this, but my granddad was a fluent German speaker because my great-grandmother on my dad's side had migrated from Bavaria and never really got to grips with English. So German would be a language that my family has lost. And even though I was never really aware of that, my dad spent a long time trying to learn German, and there are bits of that side of the family that feel slightly more. I mean, there are small traditions that I then see people online joking about as being typically German. And I go, okay, that looks a bit more like me, like hikes after dinner on holidays instead of, just relaxing and stuff. I really loved languages at school. I was always fairly good at them. The first language I tried to learn was French. And contrary to what many people would expect about me, I still don't speak French to this day. And I felt that I was very bad at languages in primary school. It was only in secondary but I really kind of got good at it. I was then moved to top set. I did French and Spanish, and then at GCSEs, my parents really wanted me to do Spanish. They thought it was a more useful language, and that's the language I then did throughout my education. And I finished school. I really wanted to go and actually genuinely use Spanish. So I did a gap year, but I was very adamant not to do a typical gap year. I found a job. I worked as a self-employed English teacher, which involved all sorts of taxes and trying to figure out life. And we were leaving the EU at the time. So I had to get my residency or my temporary residency. I think I got it on the day that Brexit formally happened.
Oh, well done.
Which was really fascinating. And then that's kind of defined me. The ability to speak more than one language, I think, is so important. It changes your perspective. It changes the way you view life, different cultures, the way you kind of interact with others. And it lets you kind of broaden your horizons. And I've always kind of wanted to go into that field of language policy. I've always quite liked being at home. I wanted to study in Cardiff back in 2019, but when I was making those decisions, I decided that Russian would be good for career prospects at the time. And so Cardiff didn't do it. I ended up in Bristol. I then ended up back in Cardiff anyway for the masters, and I really love it. And I knew before I came that if I wanted to kind of get into this sector, I would have to learn Welsh. It's not a choice for me. And that's kind of why I've gone into my other languages as a background. I think it's a values thing for me as much as it's anything. If you're big on things like bilingualism or multilingualism, you can't move somewhere and not learn the language of the area, because you then become part of a dynamic that is, threatening language and linguistic diversity. And I think Wales is a great example where it's the one place in the UK where you could genuinely have a situation where you have a thriving kind of multilingual scene. There are other places, but Wales is kind of the biggest opportunity for it in my mind. And that was the main kind of reason for me. And then I felt much more validated when on my course, a lot of my lecturers and my friends are first language Welsh speakers. I've been able to interact with them in Welsh. My Welsh has come a long way because of that. And it's given me a community moving in somewhere that's made me feel much more at home than in many other places, because I think it ties into another trend that's going on at the same time, which we see all over politics and everyone's talking about it, which is this loss of the kind of community that's happening pretty much everywhere. People talk about the high streets and the town centres. And I think the shared experience of speaking a language that isn't as spoken, so Welsh here in Wales, gives you a stronger kind of bond with people that you meet who also speak that language. And if they're first language speakers and you've learned, and they then find that out, there is a lot more kind of gratitude for you taking time to learn it. And it's still, sadly, fairly rare for people to do this. So it's celebrated a bit too much. I think of it as something people should do. I recognize a lot of people find it hard to learn languages. I felt that way when I was in primary school. But I think it's one of those things of, if we don't learn it, they can't speak it either. We might get into this. It kind of turns into language rights. If you want Welsh to thrive and succeed, you're going to have more people to be able to understand it at least. Otherwise, you're never going to really reverse the dynamic of there are fewer and fewer speakers every time we do any measure.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the thing. And I had this conversation about a year ago with Juan Grenville, who used to be the CEO of Yes Cymru, and the first CEO of Yes Cymru, and he was saying that he's when he was growing up, he there was sort of a lot of infighting about how the language should be presented to the world and owning it and whether it should be shared and all that sort of thing. And his son, who's sort of like Cymraeg to devolution, those tensions don't exist in the same way, particularly around agreements on national identity and all that sort of thing. I suppose it's that thing, isn't it, of the ideal that you want in your head of how a country should be and how a language should be spoken versus the practicality and actually being able to deliver that. So that's sort of all part of the challenge. I suppose also in terms of like names and identity and belonging and creating that sense of community, I've always been struck by the fact that Wales is a sort of derivative from Anglo-Saxon meaning foreigner. So a name given by outsiders, while Cymru means compatriots, neighbours, which is a fascinating thing. What does that tell us about Welsh identity in terms of the language that we use and the words that we choose to describe Wales, name Wales, but also then the other elements of that too?
I think it's fascinating, and I think it's a testament to the multiple identities you have in Wales and the different kind of groups. You've got a fairly big English population. I mean, English-born population. You've then got a Welsh population that is English-speaking, and then a Welsh population that is Welsh-speaking. And so you've got very different identities and experiences that come with that, and they are fairly geographically located. So you've got, the Valley's identity. You've then got what they call a Gymru Gymraeg or a Fro Gymraeg, the kind of the western and northwestern areas where the Welsh language has done comparatively well. It's doing much better. It's still a majority language in many places there, and I think it's testament to the kind of the struggle that Welsh has had to become accepted, which is something that is taken for granted. But there will be many language campaigners who I talk to who remember days when there was still a lot of hostility towards the language. But I think it's also testament to the fact that a lot of the history is often that there is still a battle for it in many ways. And when I talk a lot about language policy, I like to start with the fact that I think in the first census in 1911 or before, Welsh was still a majority language, and it's the fact that Welsh has become a minority or minoritized language is very recent. If you're talking about trends in languages, it's only the past 100, 200 years that this has actually happened, which in many other cases, it happened much longer ago, much further back in time. So you then get this kind of misconception, often from English people moving in, or a lot of the English friends I had when I was learning Welsh in Bristol, where people don't think Welsh is spoken as much as it is, because they're missing out the fact that actually it wasn't necessarily in a majority English-speaking area until fairly recently. And then on top of that, you've got the fact that I think I only recently experienced doing my dissertation and interviews, where you meet people who are first language Welsh speakers and you're speaking in English, and they will struggle for a word in English, and you go, oh, okay, I now understand, I get it. There are people who it's much more natural and comfortable for them to speak Welsh. And I mean, for any other language, we think about Spain, we think about France, we think about Germany, you would take that for granted. It's weird that across the border, we don't really take that for granted in Wales. And when you hear the kind of the stereotypes that no one really speaks Welsh anyway, they just put it on the sign so that we can't understand, despite the fact that a lot of the signs are bilingual and there are still monolingual English signs in many parts of Wales. It's just madness. You wouldn't do this with any other language. You wouldn't go on holiday to another country and many people would expect them to speak English, but you wouldn't expect it was a first language for them. So I think the Cymru versus Wales thing is so fascinating because you'll get, many people who fit into that kind of Welsh identity side who will defend Wales as the name. There was that debate a year or two ago about changing it to Cymru, and there were kind of many Welsh identifiers who are now attached to the term Wales. And I think even that is testament to how complex this really is. It's not clear cut. There is a lot of different kind of stereotypes or beliefs that come from all over the place and make it much harder to kind of push for a common approach to this. And I think I'll make this point again. UK-wide, there is stuff that needs to be done to raise awareness for Welsh. It isn't just about what's happening here in Wales. If we don't get more people across the border to realise there is something going on here, then it's much harder to make the case for.
Yeah, and I suppose it speaks to Westminster's reluctance to historically recognise Wales as it's sort of the like in terms of devolution progression. Devolution being, the movement of power from the centre to other parts of a given country or nations within a collection of countries. And I always say that, the UK is, rather than a nation state, it's a state of nations. And it's a collection. And in Scotland, they have more powers, and to a lesser extent, Northern Ireland has more powers than Wales. Give it in terms of justice and things like that. And a lot of that's to do with the Troubles and the history of Northern Ireland and its relationship with the UK and with the Republic. When I was talking to Gwan and others, I think it's around 56-60% of the Welsh budget goes on health, for example. So a big percentage of resources goes on healthcare. The next is education, but that isn't bilingual education, that's education overall. And then there's culture is another key part, which within culture is not just language, it's historic monuments and preservation of buildings and so on. So when you get down to it, the nitty-gritty of how much money is actually spent on the Welsh language, people will say, well, you spent all this money on road signs, for example. Similar vibe to we spent all this money on 20 miles an hour or whatever. It detracts from the main arguments.
Just to jump in as well, it's also because I found this trying to research for my dissertation, and maybe I'm missing something. I'll always front up with that. But it's really hard to find any overall Welsh language spending because it's hidden amongst all these different things.
Yes,
I'm sure this happens in other briefs as well. But if it's coming from councils, you then have to find out what councils are spending on, and if they're classing it as, if it's roadsides, is it coming out from language and stuff? And so there's this kind of conception that we're funneling lots of funds into a language, but when you look, it's often, much less comparatively than all other spending areas. And I think fascinatingly, when we talk about education, this will probably come up. There's all sorts of, we've got Welsh medium, dual language, English. We've just had the Welsh Language and Education Act to change the framework again, but it puts a lot on local authorities to do this. And it becomes, this stuff isn't easy. What the government has as its language target, 1 million speakers by 2050, and a doubling of use from 10 to 20%. It's really hard to do. There's nowhere really that's been successful in reversing language shift, which is what their policies, they come from that theory. And so it kind of baffles me if you're not recording at least what's going where in an easy way to understand for people. This thing that is really hard to do becomes much, much harder.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose as well, not this is a more general point about devolution rather than a criticism of a given political party or anything, but the ambition of devolution and of Welsh government has always been there. If you look at your Future Generations Act or anything like that, these are landmark, and even the Welsh language policy, or I work in housing, so the passing of the homelessness bill, for example, these are smoking bans and what have you. The list goes on, and one of the biggest recycling nations in the world, and what have you. These are really, really great ambitions, but it's also like putting the resource behind it. And a lot of the time it's because Wales doesn't have the tax raising policy to do it, that they have to rely on the main grant that comes from from the UK government as well. So whatever criticisms you have about the Welsh government, a lot of it relates to, as you've said, the wider relationship with the UK, and the UK taking, Westminster taking Wales seriously in terms of funding. And I guess that links to, why is language political? So your Substack focuses on sort of the politics of language policy for people who don't live in Wales or understand the context. Why is the language so political? And what's, if a sort of potted history of the Welsh language?
I think even in Wales, in the language campaign, there is a reluctance to talk about the politics of it because it's historically been under threat. And I personally think we've moved into a new period. There's a lot of goodwill to the language. A lot of people say there's goodwill to the language, but if you don't have explicit reasoning for things like the million speakers, and I'll take that as a really good example of how it's political. There is this goal that the government has to reach 1 million Welsh speakers by 2050. If you asked linguists or experts in policy why 1 million was chosen or why the year 2050 was chosen, people won't give you an answer that's based on theory or policy. And there was a lot of reluctance for it because it was viewed as the wrong goal. The real goal that everyone will then point to is the second goal that's almost hidden and not really talking about, which is the 10% to 20% in daily use, which would do much better for linguistic vitality, as it's called. And there's many different ways to measure it, but vitality takes into account things like use, environments it's used in. It's not just a measure of the number of speakers, because depending on how you measure these speakers, and it's interesting that different people class themselves as speakers based on different things. So I would be reluctant to call myself a Welsh speaker. I've written a blog about this before because it has connotations to me of growing up speaking Welsh your entire life, and it feels like I'm taking someone else's identity from them and kind of brandishing it as my own. And so it leads to quite a lot of underreporting, to be fair to the government. So you've probably got more Welsh speakers than the census is ever going to record, but also things like the census aren't designed to measure it. So you've got that kind of goal. And then what policymakers will often then say, defending it, is, but it's done really well to raise awareness for it. Everyone speaks about 1 million speakers. Everyone accepts we need to get there. But then you get certain actors questioning the logic behind it or whether it's needed. And then talking about, if people want to choose the language, they can. We should have it as a kind of choice thing. And I think that's when the politics becomes really important, because if you don't have those solid reasonings to defend a policy like that, when you get asked those questions, you can't answer it. And that has often happened with the 1 million speakers target. And so I then reframe it as, if we miss that target by 2050, which all of the data is suggesting we will, the next generation of policymakers and politicians, how are they going to argue that you should carry on and that you should continue to invest in the language, which I think they should? You make their job much harder because people will be able to point and say, you said this by then, you've missed this target. People might start to question it more. And I think that's why it becomes this really political thing. The languages we choose, the languages that we have access to, has always been entirely political. The reason that Welsh is no longer a majority language in Wales is because of policies in education that have been imposed onto Wales. And a lot of that ties into the kind of colonial history and the kind of going back to the conquest. But, even then, Welsh was still the language that was needed to communicate. It acted as a kind of gateway between the people living here and the kind of nobility that had moved in. And that's why the politics of this is so important, because if you can't justify or make the case for these things, they become incredibly vulnerable to attack. And I think the consensus around the Welsh language probably isn't as big as we say. There is a famous example that's often used, which is, I think, 80% of the population say that Welsh is something to be proud of, as in the language, which is good. But I don't think that is necessarily the same as what percentage of the population would be willing to make personal sacrifices to learn Welsh, to help Welsh, which is what we would really need And so it's a kind of, I don't want to term it, it's I want Welsh to do well, but I don't want it to affect me.
Mm.
And I think as long as that is the case, we then need to talk about the politics of, why aren't we giving everyone the opportunity to speak Welsh through the education system? The Welsh Language Act goes away to try and resolve that, but it's a very pragmatic approach. It's not necessarily ensuring that everyone comes out with the same standard of Welsh. And I think that will lead to more and more generations. And you find it now. Many people who've gone through school, many friends I've got who've gone through learning Welsh as a subject, which ask anyone who's done GCSE Spanish or French. It's not the best way to teach languages. And we've known this for a long time. When they turn 18 and they inevitably stop using the language as much because it's just been a subject, you then lead to a generation that will have a much more critical relationship with Welsh, where they will remember it as something they may have been good at school, maybe they weren't, but they'll have a memory of being able to do a bit of it and then not being able to and feeling like they've lost something.
Mm.
And I personally don't think that's fair. And I think if we don't start talking more about the politics of all of these things, then these issues are just hidden away behind the surface as if they're not happening.
Mm.
I think that's the thing that frustrates me. I get for many, many, many language campaigners, it would be quite scary to talk about these policies and the kind of justifications because it's taken so long to get to a point where Welsh is normalised and accepted. But I don't think that means the journey's over. And I think we should use the goodwill we've got now, which is higher than ever, to push further, guarantee more for the state of the Welsh language, which is, if you look at the data, it's stark. There is no sign of the trends being reversed of the shift from English to Welsh. The worrying stuff is the census coming down, the last two censuses, is normally due to a drop in the number of speakers aged between 5 and 15. So it's young people. And I think that ties into the dynamics of social media. There's a lot of dominance of English there. And the kind of big global languages, Spanish is quite popular. And that's happening across the world. There is not a country where they're not struggling with their kind of own languages because of the kind of sheer dominance of the kind of, I want to say Anglosphere, because it's mainly driven by, American media.
Yeah. Yeah. And how homogenous the Anglosphere is. And that's the soft power of imperial legacy as well, isn't it? I suppose that just like in years past in England, French was the language of the court, the royal court and of and everything. Yeah, English has sort of dominated things for a while. I wonder if that changed because of a combination of, there's obviously a huge amount of Spanish speakers in America, and Bad Bunny's performance at Super Bowl proved made the president very annoyed, but proved the point that you have a tremendous amount of Spanish speakers and other languages that are spoken in America, and like in London, for example, I think London has the second biggest French population, or the biggest French population outside of France, for example, and not French speaking, but like actual French people. Yeah, and London is an example where I'd be really interested to see the breakdown of language there. Cause
I think I've seen from Sophia Smith-Gala, who's a fantastic language journalist who studied, I think, Spanish and Arabic. I could be wrong on that. She's been working to map London's languages, and I'm really looking forward to that. She's also written a book called How to Kill a Language, which I still need to pre-order and get. And it's really interesting the times we're in, because we're, in Wales, we are used to talking about language more, whether it's stereotypical, whether it's, jokingly or talking about the road signs, we're aware that it's there. Whereas in these kind of monolingual areas, so across the border in England, in the States, it's been very hidden. If you spoke about language policy to people would think you just meant schooling. But actually, as you've just mentioned there with Bad Bunny, great example that language is political and everywhere has language policy, because one of Trump's biggest things is an attack on Spanish, because Spanish is becoming a very dominant language in the States, and it is political for them. They don't want that to happen. And I think it's fascinating to see it coming up in the kind of more mainstream politics. And it is often Spanish. And it's interesting that, to be a lingua franca, you do have the imperial history and colonialism, etc. A lot of people would then refer to the kind of population of China and the kind of common quip that Chinese Mandarin will probably be the next lingua franca. But one thing is really important is it needs to be easy to learn at a beginner level. And Spanish and English tick those boxes. And so if you look at the amount of second language speakers of Spanish is growing at an incredibly quick rate in a lot of the states and has possibly in decades' time the chance to become a lingua franca because of that. It's becoming taught for businesses. I remember when we went to uni, there was a unit of Spanish for business because it is taking on those functions. And this is what I mean, even if we think, the governments in London will never say that we have language policy, but they have things like the British Council that they put funding into. They have the choices of which languages they make their websites available in. You've got different councils doing that. So Cardiff Council has many languages available because it knows it needs to communicate with the kind of diverse populations we have. So it is always there. Language policy is always there. And language is so fundamental to us as humans because it's pretty much everything about our identity and about us is a factor of the language we speak and how we speak it. And without language, there's not much more. And it's fascinating that it's often overlooked.
Yeah, and I think in Wales in particular in South Wales, in Cardiff, you look at the different populations that have lived here since the Industrial Revolution. A big Polish population, big Chinese population, for example. And I used to work for Cardiff Confucius Institute at Cardiff Uni. So I did that for a year in the School of Modern Languages. And obviously, since I was there, the university, I did previous episode about this, about cuts at Cardiff University. And languages has been massively cut. And that's the same across the sector. And part of that is to do with the pipeline of people that are studying languages. German is dying in terms of uptake of language, French as well. Spanish and Mandarin, I think, are the two which are really are the only ones that are going up. And it was the first time I'd ever worked in an environment where I was a minority in terms of my identity, I guess. Working with Chinese colleagues, majority Chinese colleagues. And I was able to learn so much more about China and their own conflicts of how they felt about the regime, how they felt about their place in the world, their perceptions of what the UK was like. And a lot of them wanted to stay here because there was opportunities. Also, a lot of Chinese leave China because you get preferential treatment when you go back for housing. So if you study abroad, you're more likely then to get a home when you come back because you're able to bring something with you back to China in terms of a new language and understanding a different culture. And other countries understand this a lot more. And that's another factor, I suppose, is about mobility of students to study and then come back. Whereas in Wales, we have this problem where we invest a lot. Second biggest budget for us is the education budget. We spend so much money on universities and schooling and everything, but we lose it in terms of people going elsewhere. And I suppose it's sort of making an attractive offer for people to stay is a big challenge. That's the end of part one, sort of left on something that really matters, the brain drain, keeping young people in Wales and giving them real space to use their Welsh professionally is one of the biggest challenges facing the language right now. Next week, in part two, Ben and I step back from the modern policy picture and look into the history. We're talking about the Blue Books and the Welsh Not, the policies that explicitly tried to stigmatise the language and shame its speakers, and the psychological weight that history still carries today. We'll also end this the two-parter on a practical note, with Ben sharing some Welsh phrases to help anyone start using the language in everyday life. The title track for this show is Young Shall Grow, with thanks to Afro Cluster, Magugu and Asha Jane. Sparrowfort is a Be The Change Media Network production. I'm Tom Spare. Thanks for listening.
on the know. In this life you don't give up, even when you know. If you fall, get back up. Young shall grow, whether you like them or not. Young shall